All right. Welcome, everybody, to tonight's class. What we are going to do is explore kind of what really happens on Rosh Hashanah. Now, when I say what really happens, it's like this. When it comes to Rosh Hashanah, not everybody has the the greatest relationship with the holiday itself, or even the concept of Rosh Hashanah. But without even getting into that, let's just build from the bottom up. Go back to the basics. Go back to the big books. Shimon likes to talk about. He wants the book that everybody's written in. I'm talking about a different big book that we're all written in as well, but also this guidance there, and that is the Torah. Let's go back to the sources, explore what Rosh Hashanah is really all about, and maybe it'll enhance and enrich this year's experience of Rosh Hashanah. So if you have I put in the chat box a link to the source sheet if you want to use that, but that's not a must. Now, in short, if we look into the actual Torah itself, right, that's where we have all the holidays from. Pesach is in the Torah, Sukkot is in the Torah, and each holiday comes along with how to observe it and why we are observing it. If we look in the Torah, it tells us twice, once in the book of Leviticus and once in the book of Numbers, regarding this holiday that is meant to take place on the first day of the 7th month. And that was back in the times where the months on the Jewish calendar started in Nisan, the month that they left Egypt. That was the first month that they counted from. So the 7th month in our current calendar is otherwise known as Tishrei, the month that we celebrate Rosh Hashanah in. Now, what happens is the Torah just says, on this day, you shall not do any work. In other words, just like on a regular Shabbat and Yom Kippur, you're not allowed to do any work. So too, on this day, you're not allowed to do any work. And the Torah calls it a Yom Teruah. Really, in Leviticus, it calls it a Zichron Teruah, which means a remembrance for the sound of the shofar. And in the book of Numbers, it calls it Yom Teruah, the day of the sounding of the trumpet or the shofar. Now, just to pick on that just for a moment, we're not going to get caught up into that. Well, how come in one place the Torah says it's a remembrance for blowing the shofar? In another place it says it's for the day of blowing the shofar. The way we reconcile that, as the rabbis explain, we know that when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar, and they say that's what it's referring to. In Leviticus, it's talking about when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbat, like it was last year, one of the days we're on Shabbos, we didn't blow the shofar. But if Rosh Hashanah falls out on a weekday, we blow the shofar. Okay, but that's it. Okay, without getting into that. Now, let's continue. All right, so that's it. The Torah tells us about it. Now, Nachmanidis, you can look at this in source number 3. I'll just post it again in the chat just for those who came now. If you'd like to see a source sheet. Okay, so source number 3, and this is from Nachmanidis on the Torah. And Nachmanidis, who was a 14th century Spanish sage, a physician, a philosopher, and he says something fascinating. He says, when you look throughout all the holidays in the Torah, we know why we celebrate each one. For example, when it comes to Sukkot, it's because God took us out of Egypt and protected us with the clouds of glory. And that's to represent our vulnerability and our trust in God for protecting us. Then we have the holiday of Pesach, which is the holiday of freedom, when God took us out of slavery. We have the holiday of Shavuos, which is the holiday we celebrate the giving of the Torah and the first fruits of the season. And we have the holiday of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is because that was 120 days after we received the Torah. Long story short, there was a lot that happened between receiving the Torah and Yom Kippur, and that was the golden calf. And Yom Kippur was the day that God openly forgave us and gave us the second set of tablets, second set of luchos. And if that's the case, Nachmanidis points out, why is it that with Rosh Hashanah, the Torah is so vague? Why should it be a day? First of all, why are we blowing a trumpet? And second of all, why can't we do work? What's so special about this day? What in the world are we celebrating? To the point that the Torah absolutely does not tell us. Nachmanidis there actually goes on to say that really all Rosh Hashanah is, it's a 10-day preparation for Yom Kippur. That's all it is. And that really the whole holiday is essentially Yom Kippur, not Rosh Hashanah itself. And he goes on to explain it in a fascinating and a beautiful fashion, but we're not going to get into that now. Let's put that on the side. So far, our holding is on Rosh Hashanah, we're not allowed to do any creative work, just like a regular Shabbat and holiday. We have to blow a trumpet. But at this point, what is the significance of this day? And where do we even get the name Rosh Hashanah, which means the head of the year? And the Torah mentions nothing about that. All it says, on the first day of the 7th month, you're going to blow a horn or a trumpet. And that's it. So what's going on over here? How do we truly understand this? Hey, welcome. Come on in. Pull up a chair. Get comfortable. Now, he says like this. So the first time we find the term Rosh Hashanah being used is actually in a Mishnah, in a rabbinic text. So if you look at source number 4, we have the Mishnah. The Mishnah is in Tractate Rosh Hashanah, and it's a little bit uninspiring to say the least. And we'll see why. Because the Mishnah says as follows. There are 4 periods during the year that we consider a new year for something. For example, one of the more famous ones is either the 1st or the 15th of the month called Shvat is known as the new year for trees. We're in source number 4. But in this Mishnah, it lists 4 different times during the year. One of the periods of the year, it says on the 1st of the month of Tishrei, which is when we celebrate Rosh Hashanah, is a New Year's. For what? So the Mishnah says, Lashanim for years, which means that when there was a non-Jewish king, whenever you signed a document, you had to write what number year it was for that king's rule. And when did the cycle reset? In other words, when was the new year for that? The 1st of the month, Tishrei. The second is Shemitah, right? We know that every 7 years, every 7th year, the Jewish people were not allowed to work the land of Israel. When did that year's cycle start? From the 1st of Tishrei. The Jubilee, when did that cycle start? The 1st of Tishrei. When it comes to planting a tree, we know that when you plant a tree for the first 3 years, you're not supposed to use its fruits. How are you supposed to calculate the years? Very simple. Anything planted before Rosh Hashanah was the year before. In other words, before the 1st of Tishrei. And Le'Yerakis is how to give tithes for vegetables. In other words, you had to give for each year's produce had to be tithed. How do you calculate the year? No, it's from the 1st of Tishrei. But none of this is very inspiring as to why Rosh Hashanah should be significant in our lives, and it should be such a special day that we use. Exactly, it's a very technical holiday, and it's not much of a holiday based on that. So what is so special about Rosh Hashanah? Now, let's move forward. Source number 5. We have another Mishnah in the same tractate Rosh Hashanah, and the Mishnah reads as follows. Beautiful idea. It says that there are 4 periods throughout the year that the world is judged. Okay. It says that on Pesach we are judged for grain, on Sukkot we are judged for water, Shavuos for the trees, for the fruits, and on Rosh Hashanah, the 1st of Tishrei, all creatures, all living beings of the world are passed in front of God like sheep. And how do we know this? In other words, we're judged. And how do we know this? Because it says in the verse, Hayoitzer Yachad Libam Hamevina Kol Maasem, which means he who fashioned their hearts, who considers all their deeds. That's from Psalms. Which means as follows. The only way that we know that Rosh Hashanah is a day of extremely special significance is 100% through tradition that we have since Sinai. In other words, passed down from God to Moses orally, and Moses to the rest of the nation orally. And that tradition was unbroken till this very day. So back to our original question, what is so special about Rosh Hashanah? The Mishnah here clarifies it for us. It's the day of judgment. Now I just want to bring up something beautiful on the concept of judgment, but we're not going to get into it too deeply right now. And that is, does anybody here like being judged? No. None of us like being judged, and there's so many things that human beings do to protect ourselves from judgment because we're scared of judgment. We're scared of being judged. However, if we take a closer reading at this Mishnah, we'll see something phenomenal. What does it say? The verse that it brings that God judges us says that he who fashioned their hearts alike, who considers all their deeds. In other words, nobody minds. Why don't we like to be judged? Because people have bad information. In other words, nobody knows my entire life story from beginning to end. Nobody knows what I've been through. Nobody knows where I'm coming from and where I'm actually going. And if that's the case, anybody who's judging me, even if they're right, they're automatically wrong. Why? Because they don't have the right information. And because of their bad information, they don't have enough information about me. They're obviously going to come to an incorrect judgment. And I feel like they're taking advantage of me. I feel like they're going to think badly of me. However, if there were to be a person that knows everything about me, knows my struggles, knows everything I've been through, and actually loves me and cares about me, not only would I not be afraid of this person to judge me, I would want to go to this person and have them judge me. Not only that, Americans and people around the world are paying millions and millions a year for people to do that. It's called a therapist. In other words, somebody who you feel completely comfortable with, somebody who has your best interest in mind, you are willing to pay them to judge you. And especially when you have a good friend, when you have a very close friend or a mentor, you go to this person because you want them to judge you because they have enough information about you. They know you, they love you, and they care for you. And that their judgment is only going to bring you to a better place. And that's what it is when we are judged on Rosh Hashanah. It's not this old man sitting there with his huge book and he's ready to throw the book at us. And that he has something he's out to get us and he's going to nitpick at every little mistake and every little thing that I ever did in my life. Such a God doesn't exist. Such a judgment day doesn't exist. Rosh Hashanah is a day. It's a beautiful day of judgment. It's a day where Hashem, the one who fashioned our hearts, the one who knows everything that we've been through, the one who set it up exactly to be that way, that is the one who's judging us. And if that's the case, scary day, I think not. A beautiful day, a very meaningful day, and a very powerful day, but not something to be scared of. Now, so that's just a little bit on judgment. Before we continue, are there any questions or comments? Oh. Okay, so very good. So let's get to that. And right, like Shimon was just asking, what is the judgment? And just to make the question even stronger, which we're really going to explore momentarily, is what's the purpose of judgment then? In other words, my friend, I get it. I need to go to my friend or my therapist. They give me a little bit of judgment to give me a little bit of direction. But what exactly is judgment that we have going on with God? So let's explain this by first exploring why would Rosh Hashanah be the day of judgment? Right? So to us, we think because it's the new year. But as we saw that for centuries, when the new year for them was from the month of Nisan, so Rosh Hashanah wasn't necessarily, the first of Tishrei wasn't necessarily the new year. Exactly, it was the first day of the seventh month, like it says clearly in the Torah. And that's how it was for hundreds of years, from the giving of the Torah till the times of the second Beis HaMikdash. It was always the first day of the seventh month. So why would Rosh Hashanah be the day of judgment? So let's. I was scared you were going to ask that question. We'll have to dedicate an entire class just to that. Okay, so now let's continue. Let's jump straight to it, to source number 7. Now we have a tradition, and the tradition goes as follows. Really, this is number 6 and 7 together. The tradition goes as follows. When was the world created? So, based on the reading of the Gemara, in source number 6, the world was created on the first day of Tishrei. And that's why judgment takes place. And that's why it's called the head of the year. So even in times where it wasn't the new year, because the new year cycle didn't start then. For certain aspects it did, but certain aspects it didn't. But it was the start of something new. And what was that? Creation of the world was the first of Tishrei. And that's why the judgment would be on that day. Now that doesn't fully explain it. Which we're going to understand now. Let's take a look in source number 7. This is a beautiful reading from the Midrashic work. All right, so we're talking about 2nd, 3rd century of the Common Era. And it reads as follows. In this reading, it tells us the world was not created on the 1st of Tishrei, rather on the 25th day of Elul. right? So we're coming up now today, tonight is the 16th day of Elul. So the 25th day of the month Elul was when the world was created. And that would mean that Rosh Hashanah, the day that we celebrate as the first day of the year, it was the 6th day of creation, the day that Adam and Chava were created. Now, what happens is as follows. According to this reading and this tradition, so it says that in the first hour of the day, God came up with the idea of creating human beings. The second hour of the day, he advised with the angels. The third hours of the day, God gathered the dirt from which to create Adam and Chava. The fourth hour, God mixed it into clay. The fifth hour, he fashioned it. The sixth hour, he made it into a golem, which is basically a human clump of clay. The seventh hour, he blew a soul into the body of Adam. The eighth hour, Adam and Chava entered the Garden of Eden. The ninth hour of the day, they were commanded not to eat from the tree of knowledge. The 10th hour of the day, they ate from the tree of knowledge. I just want to point out, between the 9th hour and the 10th hour, they had 2 children already. But anyways, yeah. Now, the 11th hour, they were judged for their transgression. The 12th hour, they were let off the hook. So God said to Adam as follows, "Let this be a sign for your children and all future generations, that on this day they will stand in judgment and they will be let off the hook." And when will this be? This will be on Rosh Hashanah every single year. So this is where we get the whole idea of why on the first day of Tishrei, which for us happens to be the new year of the year as well, and in biblical times it was the first day of the 7th month, that's why it's the day of judgment. It almost is the anniversary of the first judgment, and that repeats itself every single year. Now, based on this idea, firstly, who cares? Now, why does there need to be this anniversary of judgment just because Adam was judged on the first day of creation? So what, we're celebrating the fact that he was judged, so God is going to judge us? That's not fair. Adam and Chava had their own issues with God. So God says, all future generations, we're going to do this again. And secondly, what's the point of this judgment? Does God really need to judge us? Is this kind of some kind of reward and punishment? It's not really the reward and punishment, even though we should dedicate a separate class to that, because reward and punishment doesn't work that way. It doesn't work on Rosh Hashanah in this classic sense that we usually discuss or talk about God's reward and punishment. So what's the purpose of this judgment? We'll find out. Now, just to bring out another point, is if Rosh Hashanah is all about judgment, and that's what the day is. It's a day of judgment that based on what we did, as everybody knows that this is the scene, even though it does mention that, but we'll see soon that we kind of misunderstand this scene of judgment. There's a big scene where some old guy comes out with this big book. It's got all our sins and all our virtues in it. And whichever one is heavier on the scale, that's which one we walk out with, right? That's what Rosh Hashanah is all about. If that were to be true, besides for the pettiness of it, and that I don't want to make God look silly, so I'm going to say that maybe that's not so true and so simple that it's that way, because that sounds like something an angry principal would do, or somebody who lost control and is trying to flex their power. But God does not need to do that over us. But let's say that is true. But then wouldn't it make sense that Yom Kippur should come before Rosh Hashanah? Why? If Yom Kippur is the day of atonement, the day of cleansing of all sins, shouldn't we have the day of cleansing of all sins first? Once we have a clean slate, say, hey, God, now we're ready for judgment. It'll be a day without any anxiety, without any sadness, without any, mystery. We know it's going to be good. Yeah. So if that's the case, well, how are we to understand that? How are we to reconcile that? Yeah. We can appreciate this based on a slight really not really contradiction because it was reconciled, but something that we saw before, but we see it clearly in the liturgy that of the prayers that we say on Rosh Hashanah. This is in source number 8. This liturgy comes from the Talmud, and it's a funny term. During the prayers on Rosh Hashanah, we say as follows: Zeh hayom tchilas ma'asecha, zikaron liyom rishon, which means this is the day, which is the beginning of your work, a remembrance of the first day. Now, how are we to understand that? Is today the beginning of the work, which would mean that it's the first day, or is it a remembrance of the first day? So at first glance is, no, that today on Rosh Hashanah, so for example, in just 2 weeks from now, it's going to be Rosh Hashanah 5782. So we're going to say that this Rosh Hashanah 5782 is the beginning of your work, remembering Rosh Hashanah 5,782 years ago. But based on the 2 passages in Talmud we saw before, it's something very different. We say, today on Rosh Hashanah, Zeh hayom, this is the day that is the beginning of your work. But now the question is, we know Rosh Hashanah is not the beginning of creation. It's not the beginning of God's work. God's work started 6 days before that, right? This is the 6th day of creation, not the first day of creation, because Rosh Hashanah is celebrated on the day that Adam and Chava were created. So we say that this day is the beginning of your work because it reminds you of the beginning of creation. But still, what does that mean? So it explains in Kabbalah and Hasidus as follows: that seemingly we should celebrate Rosh Hashanah on the day that the world was created, not on the day that Adam and Chava were created. So from an elementary understanding of what we read, we said, no, we're going to celebrate it on the day that Adam and Eve were created because that's the day that they sinned. And that's what we're celebrating. In other words, we're celebrating judgment from the 6th day of creation, and every year that judgment repeats itself. But Kabbalah and Hasidus explain something phenomenal, that no, until the 6th day of creation, the world had no purpose and no direction. Why? Because why did God need to create in the world in the first place? Was it just that land should exist, water should exist, time should exist, and animals should exist? That wasn't the purpose of creation. The purpose of creation was for human beings, mortal human beings who are finite, who are feeble, who are prone to make mistakes and moral failures. Creation was for them because we needed a human being to come along who is tested by all of those mistakes and all those possibilities for mistakes and still makes the right choice. That is the purpose of creation. And that's why we celebrate Rosh Hashanah on this first day that Adam and Chava, that the human beings were created, not on the first day of creation. Because until the human beings were created, creation itself lacked a purpose. It was heading there, but it wasn't there yet. And on a simple level, that's why there is the judgment. On which day? The 6th day, not the first day. But what we still didn't explain yet is what is the purpose of this judgment? What is the purpose of God bringing us to task, so to say, every year on this day? So to appreciate this, we have to understand that there's actually something else going on during Rosh Hashanah at the same time that may be similar but different. And let's take a look at the next source. This is source number 9. Once again, as we discussed before, the traditions that the sages had from Moshe Rabbeinu, who received the Torah, and so much of Judaism is influenced by that, because without the oral tradition, the Torah is just impossible to understand and impossible to keep. The Torah says Yom Trua, it's a day of a horn. What kind of horn? What kind of trua? Trua can also mean the sound of a trumpet. We have from oral tradition that it's a ram's horn or horn similar to that. And the same thing is as follows. The Talmud reads, God says, recite before me on Rosh Hashanah verses of kingship, remembrance, and through the shofar, you'll be remembered for good things. What does that mean? So Kabbalah and Hasidus explain something phenomenal. And that is, that something else takes place every single year on Rosh Hashanah, the day that Adam and Eve were created, not the day that the world was created. And that is that we crown God as king every single year. To the extent that Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon, one of the greatest Gaonim to live in the 8th or 9th century, explains that the reason why we blow the shofar is because in ancient times, the way that you would coronate a king is you would gather by the river and you would blow an animal's horn. And he says that's what we do. We go to Tashlach by the river, we blow the shofar. He says that's how he explains many of the customs. Now, if the day of judgment wasn't problematic enough for you, when it comes to crowning God as king, that makes it even more problematic. In other words, I get it that in a democracy, you need everybody to vote in their president, whatever. In America, we have it once every 4 years. You got to vote for your president. And in old times, you needed the people to accept the king because otherwise the people would rebel against the king and overthrow the kingdom. But does God really need us, finite human beings, feeble, weak human beings, to coronate God? Really? And oh, very good. And like Shimon just pointed out, that it almost seems like we're the ones passing judgments. We're the ones deciding to coronate God as king. So what's going on over here? How do we understand this? So once again, we turn to Kabbalah and Chassidus to inform us in this area. And what actually happens to be with divine providence, for those who learn Chitas, the daily portion of Chumash and Tanya every single day. So this is from the end of today's portion, which is really tomorrow's portion. And so we're in source number 10. This is from the Tanya, the book, the seminal book of Chabad philosophy, written by the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of the Adi, in the late 1700s. And this is in the fourth part, in the letters, epistle number 14. And over there, the Alter Rebbe explains something fascinating. He says every single year on Rosh Hashanah, once again, not the anniversary of creation, the anniversary of creation of Adam and Chava. So the 6th day of creation, all of the godly energy which keeps this world in existence, keeps this world running, as soon as it hits Rosh Hashanah, everything in this world goes back to its origin. All of the godly energy comes out of this world, back to its origin, and it waits until the blowing of the shofar the next morning. So for almost 12 hours, the world is almost in a state, as the Kabbalists put it, the world is in a state of slumber. It's almost like a default setting. God is not invested in the world right now. God takes back all of that energy and decides how to reinvest the energy for the new year. And that's why every single year, there's a new energy that comes down to this world that never existed in this world from the first day of creation till today. And the beautiful idea here is, you see, that's why every single year, there are changes in this world that could not have been possible the year before. Why? Because that godly energy would not allow that, because it wasn't geared for that. Some years there are greater changes. Some years the changes are more smaller, and it takes a couple of years, a cumulative change versus sudden change. But it all depends on the year, and it depends on the godly investment that year. And that happens during the night of Rosh Hashanah. Just to illustrate with a Hasidic story, during the war between Napoleon and Russia, the Tsar and Napoleon. So there was a big argument amongst the Jewish leaders. Who would they rather win the war? Was it Napoleon or the Tsar? Now, most Jewish leaders wanted Napoleon to win the war. Why? Because Napoleon was going to take away oppression. The Tsar was all about controlling people. It was all about oppressing the people, not allowing them to have land, not allowing them to own anything. And it was really bad decrees that the Tsar made, especially against the Jews. So it seemed like Napoleon was the obvious option. The Alter Rebbe understood that it should really be the Tsar too, and that would be best for Judaism at the time. You can dedicate another class as to exactly what the philosophical argument was, but we're not going to get into that right now. So the Alter Rebbe, the leader of Chabad, the founder of Chabad, he had a very close friend who was another Hasidic leader, a Rebbe in his own right, and they made a deal that whoever blows shofar first that year, Rosh Hashanah in the morning, they will decide who's going to win the war. In other words, if the Alter Rebbe's friend would blow the shofar the next Rosh Hashanah in the morning, then Napoleon would win the war. If the Alter Rebbe blew first, the Tsar would win. So what happened was, in the shul of the Alter Rebbe's friend, they woke up very, very early that Rosh Hashanah. And they started prayers at 3 o'clock in the morning, the prayers that you're allowed to say then. And you have to understand, these people knew how to pray. Prayer Rosh Hashanah, for us, we're in shul for 4 hours and we get nervous. These people would be in shul for 12 hours. So prayers took a long time. By the time they got to blowing the shofar, it was already 1 o'clock in the afternoon. What happened in the Alter Rebbe's shul? The Rebbe woke up also early. Didn't start prayers yet. Meditation, Chassidus, as was the custom. And they were about to start prayers at the regular time. It's probably 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. But the Alter Rebbe said, wait, before we start the prayers, I'm going to blow the shofar first, which is allowed. The Alter Rebbe blew the shofar. When in the other shul, a couple of towns away, at 1 o'clock, when they got to the shofar, and they blew the shofar, the Rebbe in that shul turned around to his followers, to his Chassidim, and said, the Litvak is what they used to call the Alter Rebbe, his colleagues. It's called the Litvak. Said, the Litvak already got me. He blew shofar and Napoleon's going to lose the war. And that year, the Tsar's army defeated Napoleon. In other words, that godly investment in the world that happens on Rosh Hashanah, that happens, and that's going to set the tone for the entire year. Now, what does it mean when the Alter Rebbe says that all the godly energy, that everything in this world goes back to its origin? In short, what that means, or in simple English, what that means, is everything goes back to its ultimate purpose. Purpose. The purpose of existence, the purpose of something being. Let me explain what that means. Let's explain with a parable. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev, who was a student of the Baal Shem Tov, he was a colleague of the Alter Rebbe. He was known as the defendant of the Jewish people. He always found a good quality in even the greatest sinner. And specifically in the greatest sinner, he'd always find the greatest qualities. He once explained, when he gave a parable about Rosh Hashanah and what happens in Rosh Hashanah, went as follows. It says, there was once a king walking in the field. Sorry, not walking in the field. It was once a king who went on a journey, sightseeing in the forests around his city, around his country. And some of these territories were unknown to him. But he had his guards with him, and they were wandering along. They came to a point where they got completely lost. They didn't have cell phones and GPS back in the day. And this king is completely lost out there in the wilderness. And at this point, nobody in the wilderness there would ever recognize him as a leader or as a king. He was fair game to anybody who got him. It was no man's land, and that's just the way things were back in the day. Even in some parts of the world, they're like that today. And he's not sure what to do. He's walking around until he bumps into this old wise man. And he says, do you know the way back to the capital city where the king lives? The old man right away realized this is the king he's talking to. And he said, of course, my master. And he led them right back to the capital city, to the palace, to the point, as he says in the parable, where he sat the king back on his throne. And the king really felt that way, because the king understood that without this man, he may have never seen his throne again. Who knows what could have happened? And he tells this man, he says, I owe you my life. I owe you everything I have. And because of that, he appoints this man to be his highest ranking officer. Years pass. This high-ranking official, newly appointed, he does something which was considered treason against the king. And the king was furious, understanding that this man was so close to him, meant so much to him. How can he do this to me? And treason means death by sword or by the gallows. And the king calls this man before him and he says, do you have any last requests before I send you to the gallows? And the old man, wise old man, says, sure. He says, I want you to bring back the clothing that I was wearing the day that I met you in the wilderness. And I want you to put on the clothing that you were wearing the day I met you in the wilderness. And once we're both wearing those clothing, I want you to reconsider your decision. So the king called to the guards to bring the old clothing back, which were stored in the king's treasure house. And obviously the king's mercy was aroused. King couldn't do it. And the king let him off the hook. So the Barditchever explains, the same thing happens on Rosh Hashanah, our day of judgment. What happens? During the year, we may not have been perfect. But that's not what Rosh Hashanah is about. But in order to appreciate what Rosh Hashanah is about, we have to go back to how we met God in the first place. How did we meet God in the first place? When we were wearing rags in the desert and we accepted the Torah at Sinai. God was vulnerable to us and we were vulnerable to God. God was looking for a nation and we were his nation. We accepted God on that mountain. When a person can go back to that place, when we can go back to a place beyond all sin, beyond all mistakes, back to the true core of who we are 100% connected to God as ever possible. And the same thing is God to us. That's why Rosh Hashanah is not about sin. You see, on Rosh Hashanah, throughout all of our liturgy, throughout all of the prayers, we don't mention sin once. Because Rosh Hashanah is not about sin. But one second, I thought it's about judgment. I thought it's about all my mistakes and this old angry man with his book is going to get me in trouble. No. That day doesn't exist on the Jewish calendar. What's happening is, Rosh Hashanah is God saying to us, are you with me for another year? And in order to appreciate that, we both have to go back to our essential connection of who we are and our relationship with God and our relationship with ourselves. You see, because what happens is, just like this old man, what did the king understand? The king thought to himself, the person who committed treason wasn't the same person who I met in the wilderness. The person who committed treason was some kind of corrupted or mutated version of the guy I met in the wilderness. The man I met in the wilderness would never have committed treason against me. So the person standing in front of me is not the same person. But if we can go back to being that pure self of who we truly are, there's no such thing as sin. There's only a beautiful relationship that we have with God. There's only a beautiful relationship that we have with ourselves. Let me explain what that means. Throughout the year, things happen. We get distracted by life. And especially years like the past 2 years have been very, very difficult for all of us. With what's happening in the world, with what's happening with the leadership in the world, what's happening with society, the health, COVID, it's just crazy. And that can drive a person mad. And then forget about the regular day-to-day stuff that drives a person mad. Relationships are not easy, whether it's between husband and wife, parents and children, children and their parents, friends, community. These things are complicated. And they make us do things that not necessarily would our purest self ever do. Rosh Hashanah is that day where we get to reclaim who we truly are in the relationship that we have with ourselves and the relationship that we have with God. And that's what's happening. And here's where we bring together the concept of judgment, the day of judgment, and the concept of coronating God. They are one in the same. What is the judgment? It's not about God sitting there saying, oh, let me see what you did this past year and what I can catch you, what kind of infringements I can get you on, God couldn't care less about that. A petty person who's looking for power and control cares about that, not God. All God wants to know, are you in with me for another year? Are you willing to give it your all? Are you willing to recognize your truest, purest essence of who you truly are and ready to walk forward with me and continue with me this year or not? You see, In order to get to that point, we need to step away from the world. We need to silence all the noise and static around us, because that is what distracts us from being who we are. If we can't silence that, we can't get to that goal. And that's why we use the ram's horn. It's that, that primal animal call, that base self of who we truly are is calling out, screaming out. It's the soul saying, let me free. Or to quote God on Rosh Hashanah 5,782 years ago, Ayeka, where are you? That's when God said to Adam and Eve, he says, where are you? Are you aligning yourself with your godly purpose and mission and allowing your truest self to shine? Or are you getting caught up in all the noise and static of the world that is going to make you alien to your truest self? So we have to judge ourselves in Rosh Hashanah to come to that beautiful place of who we truly are. And God is sitting there waiting for our response. He's waiting for us to blow the shofar, to crown him, to judge him and to judge ourselves while he does the same. But it's not a judgment of here, I'm out here to get you. It's a judgment of, come on, let's get back to what we were all created for. Let's get back to who we are supposed to be and who we want to be. We can sit there and chill thinking about, where am I in life? Do I live my day-to-day life, my habits, my rituals, based on who I want to be, based on who I should be? How many people can sit there and without, batting an eye and telling the truth and say 100%, I live every moment being who I want to be? And that's what Rosh Hashanah is all about. It's about reclaiming ourselves. And that's where the judgment is. And that's such a judgment is a beautiful judgment. And on this note, a vart, an idea that I heard just a few weeks ago, is that when it comes to crowning God, like we said before, does it really make sense that I'm crowning God? And the truth is, one of the Hasidic masters explains that we're not crowning God. We're crowning the God within me, which means as follows. There are many things that can rule our lives. The things that we're scared of, the fears in our lives, the anxieties, the depressions, the insecurities. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have all of these. We all suffer from these in one way or another. But the question is, who is going to rule my life this year? Is it all of those things that distract me? Or is it the peace of God within me that is going to rule my life? Who's going to take charge? What kind of life am I going to live? And we get to decide that. How beautiful is that? So I just want to wish us all to have an amazing, happy, beautiful, healthy, sweet year with all the blessings in the world in a revealed way, in an obvious way. And like we say, why do we say have a happy, sweet new year? Why not just have a happy, good new year? It's because good, especially to the philosopher, is subject to interpretation. But sweet, there's no philosophies involved. You don't need to explain if something is sweet or not. Either it is sweet or it isn't sweet. There are no explanations. So may we all have such a year. Thank you for joining us tonight. If there are any questions, that's what I'm here for.